Benvenuti allo UC Coffee Break. Lo UC Coffee Break è per lo ucug.it, lo Unified Communications User Group Italy. Abbiamo oggi con noi David Branscombe da Microsoft che ci presenterà l'Understanding the Upgrade from SQL Mirroring to SQL Always On for Skype for Business. Okay. Hi, David. I think you can take over now as a presenter if you like, and thank you very much again to be with us for the UC Coffee Break, and it's all yours now. Please.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Fabio. Let me get control here. Just say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is for everyone there. Let me get the presentation displayed here. And as Fabio mentioned, the topic that we're going to be discussing today is understanding the upgrade from SQL Mirroring to SQL Always On as it relates to Skype for Business. My name is David Branscombe. I am a Senior Partner Technical Consultant with Microsoft, and you have my email address right there. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me, and I'll respond as quickly as possible. This is me. This is my wife. We've been married for 25 years. I've got 4 kids, 3 boys and a girl. I'm based in Dallas, Texas. As I mentioned, I've been with Microsoft for about 9 years now. I worked in Microsoft Consulting Services. I worked as a Premier Field Engineer. And I'm now working as a Partner Technical Consultant supporting Microsoft partners in their deployments of unified communications and Exchange, Office 365, that sort of thing. As far as the agenda, what we're going to be talking about for this coffee break, I'll do a quick overview of SQL Mirroring and SQL Always On, why it's necessary or why it might be a good idea. Planning for Always On, what are the things that you have to have in place prior to doing the implementation or deployment of Always On. What are the prerequisites and dependencies, and then the actual deployment and configuration of Always On, and a couple slides about some known issues that you should be aware of when you deploy Always On, so those don't bite you. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the overview of Always On. So SQL Always On is one of our high availability solutions. It's the next generation of database mirroring technology. So we've had the ability to do Always On in SQL Server 2012, and it continues to be available in the more recent versions, SQL 2014 and so forth. It gives us the ability to do disaster recovery as well as high availability with SQL databases, and it runs on top of Windows Server failover clustering. So that's going to have an impact on, for example, the version of Windows Server that we use in terms of planning and deployment. So why would we use SQL Always On? There are other methods of deploying high availability. You can do simple failover clustering, a single instance cluster, you can database mirroring and so forth. But with SQL Always On, we consider this to be our most current SQL high availability solution. Database mirroring is considered a deprecated feature. That doesn't mean it isn't supported at this point. It is supported, but it will be removed in a future version of SQL Server. So Always On will be the future of what we can. Is a more reliable method of performing high availability. You'll always have one primary database and up to 2 corresponding secondary replicas of the databases available with an always-on solution. With mirroring, you only have a single primary and a single mirror that are available to you, so you have more copies from which to recover if you end up with an issue with your primary database. You can also do what we call multi-database failovers. So with Skype for Business, you have multiple databases that are typically set up, and they kind of run in conjunction. They run together. And so when you fail over a Skype for Business infrastructure or SQL instances using mirroring, you have to fail those databases over individually. But with SQL Always On, you can fail them all over in a single failover action. There is databases can be added to an availability group that can be failed over between replicas. So lots of good information there about why we would use SQL Always On. We also use what we call synchronous commit mode. So synchronous commit mode means that any database write that takes place on the primary database also happens across all the other replicas at the same time. So in other words, there's no lag between the write action that is performed on the primary database and the write to the secondary replicas. So what that means is anything that is written to your primary databases must also be written to your secondary databases in an always-on solution. So that ensures that whatever data you have written on your primary is also going to be available on your secondary in the event that you have to do a failover. So it ensures consistency among the database instances that you have. So that's another reason why Always On is a valuable solution. All right, let's talk about planning for the Always On solution. There's a couple different instances or scenarios where we can deploy Always On. You can deploy it as a new installation. So in other words, you're deploying a brand new SQL database, and you're installing this using, again, SQL Enterprise 2012 or SQL Enterprise 2014. You add a brand new Skype for Business pool with the Always On backend to the topology, and then you install Skype for Business Server and add those databases to your availability group. The other possibility, and really the one that we're going to be focusing on today, is the upgrade scenario. So what we mean here is that you've already got an existing link pool, link 2013 pool, and you've already got databases assigned to that link pool, and they're using database mirroring, for instance, and you want to modify that so that you, in the end, have a Skype for Business pool and SQL Server 2012 or 2014 that is running SQL Server Always On. So it's important to keep in mind what you're upgrading from and what you're upgrading to, because not every scenario is going to be supported in this type of upgrade path. So this is really what we're talking here. So this will show us where we can upgrade from and what we can upgrade to, and the target that we're looking at here is that we end up with a Skype for Business Server 2015 instance. The SQL versions that are supported for Skype for Business are listed there in the third column from the left. So we can have 2008 R2, Service Pack 2, 2012 SP1, and 2014. But as far as using SQL Server Always On availability groups, what we have to do is be at, as the far right-hand column mentions, we have to be at 2012 SP1 Enterprise Edition or 2014 Enterprise Edition. So is this a little bit different than what is available with clustering or mirroring? So if you look at the columns for clustering and mirroring in the SQL versions supported, you can use Standard Edition for those versions. You can use the Standard Edition of SQL for those versions. But with Always On availability groups, you must be using the Enterprise Edition of SQL 2012 or 2014. SQL Always On, just so that everybody is aware, it isn't new in itself, but the support for Skype for Business is what is new. So we can't, for example, leverage SQL Always On availability groups if we're running Link 2010 or Link 2013. So we have to upgrade to Skype for Business in order to take advantage of SQL Always On availability groups. So a question might come up, what if a customer has failover clustering or SQL mirroring and they want to switch to Always On after their upgrade to Skype for Business? Well, that's completely supported, and that's in fact what we're recommending, that they upgrade from mirroring to Always On, because as I mentioned, future versions of SQL are going to have mirroring deprecated, and so that's really what this session is describing, that upgrade from mirroring to Always On. A couple things to take note of. So Skype for Business Server supports Always On availability groups only as active passive. So with SQL Always On, with other applications, it is possible to have active databases. But with Skype for Business Server, you must have, you can only have active passive scenario. And as I mentioned, what's particularly important from this particular page is that you can only set up SQL Always On availability groups if you have SQL Enterprise Edition. It can't be set up using Standard Edition SQL. So how is this upgrade performed? We'll see that as we go forward in the deck a little bit. So we're talking about the upgrade to Always On SQL databases here in the context of a Skype for Business upgrade. So what we need SQL Server 2012 Enterprise Edition at a minimum. So again, SQL 2012 Standard Edition is not going to be supported for the Always On upgrade. We have to have Enterprise Edition. We need to have a Skype for Business Server pool. So the first thing we're going to do is upgrade the front-end pool from Link 2013 to Skype for Business, and then we can upgrade the databases on the back end. Just as with any other type of upgrade or maintenance that you perform, we always recommend that you do a backup of your databases, just as a way of protecting yourself against any issues or failures that you might encounter. And then finally, one of the things that we're going to do is change the compatibility level. This is really only needed if you're changing versions from SQL Server 2012 to 2014. Otherwise, if you're upgrading in place using the same version, you don't need to change the compatibility level. But that is one thing you have to keep in mind. There's an important point that's made there at the bottom of the slide in red. It says that other configurations are possible and are not actively blocked, but they are not supported. So it is conceivable that a person could set up a SQL instance in Azure, have their offsite replica in Azure. This is not supported. If you run into issues, Microsoft support will not go forward in supporting you or helping you resolve the issue until you get it into a supported configuration. So just be aware of those things and make sure that you're in compliance with those requirements before you move forward. And then, as we mentioned, synchronous commit mode is the only mode that is supported. So you can have asynchronous commit where writes are committed to the primary database and then after a period of time are written to the secondary databases. But for Always On, we need to be in synchronous commit mode. There's also a point that's made that the very first bullet point under the blue heading there, we only support having replicas in the same subnet. So that can be a challenge for customers that are working on deploying disaster recovery scenarios where you have one instance of SQL in data center A and then your recovery data center is data center B, but they aren't on the same subnet. That can be a challenge. We need to be on the same subnet. So you can stretch the subnet and you'll be supported, but in many cases that isn't the configuration that the customer has, but you need to be aware of that. Failover mode has to be automatic, and there's no support for read access on these secondary replicas. I think this is actually the same slide that I had a couple slides ago, so I'll go ahead and skip over that, but this is the same thing that we were just talking about a moment ago. Prerequisites and dependencies. Let's go forward with this. So we do require Windows Server failover clustering to be installed on the Windows nodes. We need to be at Windows Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 or higher. The Windows Server failover clustering feature has to be installed, and it has to have sufficient nodes for the desired configuration. So for our configuration for Skype for Business using SQL Always On, the number of nodes can be either 2 or 3. We support only one primary node and up to 2 secondary replicas. So 3 is going to be the maximum number of nodes that you're going to have in an always-on availability group, no matter what your scenario is. So the maximum number of nodes is going to be 3. You'll have the file share witness selected as your quorum witness option, and we'll see how to do that as we work through the slides. Obviously, some very common recommendations and ones that most of you are very familiar with. We don't want to set up our cluster nodes on domain controllers. The cluster nodes have to be in the same Active Directory domain. We can't cluster across different Active Directory domains. And as I mentioned, the cluster nodes must be on the same network subnet. So in order to install the Windows Server failover clustering feature, most of you are very familiar with how this would be done. We would go into the Add Roles and Features wizard, and then in the Features area of the wizard, we would select the failover clustering feature. And again, just be aware of the constraints that are listed there on the right-hand side under the important section. Don't install this on domain controllers. Make sure they're in the same domain and so forth. We'll go through the installation of the failover clustering feature. And then what we're going to do is add the cluster nodes to the configuration, to the cluster configuration. So we're going to validate the cluster configuration. So this will be the primary server that currently has all the databases, as well as the other SQL servers that no longer have any of the databases on them. So in this case, we've got 2 servers. As you see there, SQL 1 and SQL 2 are listed as the possible nodes in this cluster. And we'll add them to be part of the cluster. They'll be verified and tested. This is what the validation wizard looks like as it goes through and inspects the cluster configuration to ensure that it will support clustering. It'll highlight any issues that it identifies with the cluster configuration to make sure it is something that can be upgraded. Once it finishes, hopefully you'll see the message there at the top where it says testing is completed successfully. The configuration appears to be suitable for clustering, and then you can either view the report, and then what you're going to want to do is have that little checkbox selected that says create the cluster now using the validated nodes. So you verify everything was successful, and then you're actually going to go through the process of creating the cluster. When you create the cluster, it's going to ask you for a name for the cluster. So this is only used for administration. Skype for Business itself doesn't care at all about this particular name. It's just the name that shows up in the failover cluster management tool. So you can name it whatever you want. It's kind of irrelevant as far as Skype for Business is concerned. Make sure when you create the cluster that you uncheck the box that's highlighted here where it says add all eligible storage to the cluster. So by default, it's going to try to add all eligible storage to the cluster configuration. However, with SQL Always On, we don't want the disk subsystems brought into the cluster. What that's going to do is if you leave that selected, it's going to bring all your existing disks into the cluster, and what that's going to do is take your linked databases offline, and generally that's going to be a bad thing for your career. So Always On doesn't require and it can't utilize shared storage. So make sure that you uncheck this box when you're creating the cluster. Once you've unchecked that and click Next, you'll see the cluster is created, and it'll give you the information about the type of cluster, the name of the cluster, IP addresses, and so forth. Then what you're going to do is define the quorum settings. So this is the wizard, the part of the wizard where we define the cluster quorum settings. The Always On configuration also requires a file share location as a resource of the availability group. So that resource is going to act as a voter when defining quorum for the cluster. This is needed because, and again, this is particularly if we have 2 nodes in the Always On cluster. So if we have only 2 nodes in the availability group, and if one of them fails, the remaining 1 node can't define quorum by itself. So we have to have a third voter, and in this case it would be a file share witness that would serve as quorum for that 2-node cluster. So we select quorum witness. We move forward here. We just define the file share witness, or define the type of quorum that we're going to use. You could have a disk as a witness, a file share as a witness, and we're going to select file share witness. Obviously, as it mentions there on the right-hand side, the quorum should not be defined on one of the nodes, right? So if you have 2 nodes in your Always On availability group, you don't want to put the file share witness on one of those nodes, because if that node is the one that goes down, then you've lost the node plus the file share witness. So just common sense planning there. And that's really what we're defining here. The file share path needs to be on a separate server. Here we've put it on a domain controller. It looks like DC02/quorum$. Again, use common sense when it comes to where you're going to put your file share witness. Put it on something that perhaps the SQL Server or Skype for Business folks have some control over and can access. That may not always be the domain controller, but could just be another file server in the environment. And it can be any server really in the environment that both of the servers in the Always On availability group will have access to. And once you click forward or click next on that, you'll move forward here to the finalization of the cluster quorum settings, and the file share witness is then going to be configured for you. So this is generally speaking how you would install a new Always On availability group, or the rather the failover server clustering or failover cluster wizard for your availability group. Now let's get into the specifics about how to actually configure the upgrade from SQL mirroring. So essentially there's 7 steps that we're looking at here. And if you kind of break these down into their basic form, what we're doing is getting all of our databases onto a single SQL server. We're going to get all those databases down to a single database instance. And then finally, we're going to upgrade to Always On. Now keep in mind that this is assuming that we've already done the upgrade from link 2013 or whatever to Skype for Business. So we already have our databases running Skype for Business. The schema has already been upgraded for the databases and so forth. This is after all that has taken place. All we're talking about here is the SQL backend being upgraded. We are assuming that you've already successfully upgraded from Link to Skype for Business, and now you want to upgrade from SQL Mirroring to SQL Always On. So let's take a look at how this actually takes place. So the first step is we want to fail over all our databases to the primary server. So with mirroring, we have the ability to run our databases on multiple SQL Server nodes. So you could have some of your Skype for Business server databases running on primary or secondary nodes in your mirroring configuration. They don't all have to be on the same SQL Server instance. But before we do the upgrade to Always On, we need to make sure that all the databases are on a single instance of SQL. So the way you would tell this, you would use the commandlet get-cs database mirror state to find the primary server for each of the databases. And it would look something like the little screenshot you see there. It'll give you the database name and the state on the primary. The state on primary should read principal. If it reads secondary, or if any of the, or rather mirror instance, you need to change that status and make sure that all the databases are running on the principal primary server. So the way that we would do that is use the invoke-cs database failover, new principal primary, to fail back those databases. Once everything is on the same SQL instance, and it is the primary SQL instance, what we want to do is actually break the mirroring that we've got configured for SQL. So we don't have the ability to just upgrade all the databases from a mirror to Always On in place. We actually have to break the mirror and then perform the upgrade following that. So the first thing we're going to do is run the commandlet uninstall-cs mirror database -drop existing databases on mirror for each of the individual database types. So for CPS DYN, RGS config, RGS DYN, RTC cat, or RTC AV, and so forth. We're going to break the mirror. And what this commandlet actually does is it not only is going to break the mirror, but it's also going to remove the mirrored copies of the databases on the other nodes. So it prevents the SQL instance from attempting to continue the mirror, but it also removes those copies so that they don't exist on the other nodes. You're going to verify that this was a successful uninstall by running the commandlet get-cs database mirror state, and you should see that the state on mirror value is database unavailable. So that will tell us that the mirror has been broken and the additional copies of the databases have been removed. Okay. This can also be done by using the uninstall cs mirror database commandlet and then actually manually deleting the databases. Either way will work just fine. Whoops, I just lost my... Okay, there we go. For a moment there, I lost my connection, but let's move forward. I believe I'm not the active presenter right now. Fabio, can you check that?
Yes, I'm going to check. It looks like that you are all good,
okay.
But yeah, seems that it's okay, and I can see actually the PPT, so you can carry on, I believe.
Do you see step 3 right now?
I see step 2.
You see step 2?
Yes, I see step 2. You can maybe I'll take over and you take back, okay?
Okay, go ahead.
I can see step 3 now.
Okay, perfect.
So you can
Thank
carry on, I guess. No problem.
All right.
You didn't do anything, basically. Go on, please. Thank you.
Okay. So our third step is upgrading from SQL mirroring. So here what we're going to do is open up Topology Builder, and what we're going to do is tell the Skype for Business infrastructure that we've previously upgraded that we no longer have mirrored SQL databases. In other words, it's just a single SQL instance. So all you're really going to need to do in this case is check the little box that's highlighted right there, enable SQL Server Store Mirroring. Actually, you can uncheck that box so that it's cleared, and then you publish the topology again. Once you publish the topology, Skype for Business will understand there are no mirrored databases available anymore. It is a single SQL database instance. So at this point, we have a single SQL instance with a single set of databases. Now, the other instances actually exist, but they have nothing on them. So we're going to take those and we're going to make them part of the Always On availability group. So what we do in step 4 here is turn on the Always On availability group capability. So we're going to go into our SQL Server Configuration Manager, and we're going to open the properties of the SQL instance, which is what you see here. You'll highlight SQL Server and go to Properties. We'll go into the Always On High Availability tab. This has to be enabled manually, and if we don't do this, your availability group cannot be created. So once you get into that tab, you click the little checkbox that says Enable Always On Availability Groups. One thing to keep in mind is if you don't see the name for your Windows Server failover cluster in this box, then it's possible that you've done something wrong during the failover server or failover cluster configuration wizard, and you might need to run through that again. Something might not be right. So if you don't see that name, go back and check your configuration, make sure everything's all right, and then you'll be able to enable SQL Always On in this tab. Once you've done that, you're going to actually have to restart the SQL instance. So you go back into your Configuration Manager, right-click, and click Restart. Now what we can do is go into the SQL management tools, and we'll configure our databases as always-on availability groups. So we've enabled the capability, but now we have to select which databases we want to configure as always-on availability groups. So remember, we already have the data in the database on the primary node, right? We never got rid of that data. We narrowed it down to a single server running a single instance of SQL, so all that data is there. We don't have to create the database, the initial database. We just have to start replicating that data to the other nodes or node in the always-on availability group. So what that means is we have to do a backup of SQL first so that we have a good copy of our data before we move forward with any more configuration. Then we have to replicate the folder structure to the other nodes. So you've got data in the folder structures on your primary database server, and you want to copy that data and the folder structure over to the other SQL nodes. Now in reality, that's probably still there already because you don't have to remove the folder structure when you break the mirror. You're only removing the database file itself. So the folder structure probably exists. You just don't have the database file itself on the other nodes. In any case, if everything looks good here, if you've got the meets prerequisites configuration listed there, or status listed there, as you see in the screenshot, then you can go ahead and finish the availability group wizard. Now, as you go through the wizard, what you're going to do is you need to go into Topology Builder and tell it that you're about to define a new SQL store. So here we'll use the fully qualified domain name of the availability group listener as the SQL Server FQDN, and the SQL Server Always On instance values. We'll use that for both of those. We'll then configure this, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that. I was trying to get the little highlighter. For the high availability settings, we're going to define it as SQL Always On availability groups, and we're going to define the SQL Server FQDN and the SQL Server availability group listener as the names that are listed there. Obviously unique to your environment. And the final thing we're going to do is associate the Skype for Business pool with the new SQL store. So we make that change in Topology Builder, we publish the topology, and then Skype for Business knows that it is now using an always-on availability group for its database, rather than previously what it had been using was, well, originally it had been using a mirroring instance, then it was down to a single database instance, and now we tell it, okay, now we're no longer in that configuration, we are in an always-on availability group. And at that point, the upgrade is done from SQL Server mirroring to always on. Now, what are some of the issues that you might encounter? So, issue number one is that clients may go into resiliency mode after you fail over an availability group to a secondary replica. So you've already got your availability group configured. You've been running for a little while now, and things have been going well. And then you fail over your databases from your primary server to a secondary server. And your clients go into what we call resiliency mode. So the reason this happens in most cases, the availability group wizard doesn't replicate the actual SQL logons from the primary to the secondary replica nodes, right? So the logons are what allow that failover to take place and to have the same permissions. So what you need to do as far as the fix, as is mentioned there, you launch Topology Builder, you download Topology, you verify your SQL Machine FQDN, that it's using the availability group listener FQDN. You use SQL Management Studio to fail over the availability group listener cluster resources to one of the replica servers, and then you run the commandlet, install CS database, configure databases, SQL Server FQDN, for instance, and the switch-update. And what that will do is actually create the missing SQL logins on the replica server. Now, ideally, you should have done this during the actual configuration of the availability group, but if you forgot, this is how you recover from that scenario. And you'll also have to do that for any other replica servers. So essentially, all it's doing is saying that I don't have the same login information for SQL on the secondary servers, and you just need to configure that to be the case. A secondary issue that might come up is that you may be unable to move SQL mirroring to an always-on availability group due to the location of the CMS database. So the reason this would happen is that if the CMS database is homed on or paired with the pool where you're attempting to move the always-on availability groups, you may be unable to change the high availability model for the backend database. So the way to fix this, there's a couple things that you'll have to take into consideration. So you have to consider how your environment is configured. So if the pool that you're using is not paired, so if you're not paired with another pool, you can use the Move CS Management Server commandlet to move the CMS database to another pool. Then you can do the upgrade and then move the CMS database back to the original pool. If it is paired and the CMS is not homed locally on the pool where you're attempting to change the back-end high availability model, you'll disable the pool pairing and uninstall the CMS database. You'll then go through the process of changing the HA model from mirroring to availability groups, reinstall the CMS database and re-enable pool pairing, and add the CMS databases to the availability group. The third scenario that's possible is if the pool is paired and the CMS is homed locally on the pool where you're attempting to change the back-end high availability model. You would invoke CS Management Server failover to fail over the CMS database to a different database. You would disable pool pairing and uninstall the CMS database, change the high availability model from mirroring to availability groups, reinstall CMS, and then add the CMS databases to the availability group. So really it's dependent on the configuration that you have in your environment and what you're trying to end up with as your final solution. And then the third scenario that's possible is a scenario where you're unable to create an always-on availability group listener due to a connection failure. So where this sometimes happens is in scenarios where there is a named instance and SQL Server is going to listen for connections on a dynamic port. However, an admin may wish to configure SQL to listen on either the default port, which is 1433 for TCP, or they could use a SQL alias to configure SQL to listen on a non-default static port. So, for example, if an admin doesn't want to use 1433 because it's a known attack port, one that people typically are going to attack, they may want to change the default port that SQL listens on to a non-default. So if you configure your SQL to listen on the default port, you'll encounter an error when attempting to create the availability group listener for SQL Always On because there will be a port conflict. So in order to resolve this, you can use a SQL alias to configure SQL to listen on that non-default static port if 1433 is already in use, and there's a TechNet article there that shows how you would do that. And then verify that the exceptions have been added correctly in Windows Firewall for the port used by the availability group listener. So those are typically the two things that you would need to do to resolve that type of issue. So ensure that they're listening on the right port, and then make sure that Windows Firewall is configured to use that port. And that really brings us to the end of our discussion today. I hope it's been useful to you. Again, you can use the email address at the beginning of the slide deck for contacting me if you have any questions about how to configure the upgrade from mirroring to always on. I'm happy to respond. I can't guarantee that I'll respond, within an hour, but I'll do the best I can. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ping me. And at this point, I will turn it back over to Fabio.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, this was really, really useful for us. And now I'm going back to in Italian, switching back to the Italian language. And let me just take over with my PowerPoint, sorry. And again, thank you very much to be with us. Ok, grazie a tutti per aver visto questo video, vi ringrazio e ci sentiamo alla prossima. Ricordatevi che potete contattarci se avete delle domande per tutta la sessione riguardo la transizione Mirror to SQL Always On. Grazie a tutti e goodbye. Goodbye David, thank you so much again. Bye now.